صوت البلد Syria.
We believe that the fullest implementation of the Geneva Communique presupposes establishment of a transitional ruling body, governing body, which is stipulated by the Geneva Communique adopted on June 30th last year. And we act on the assumption that this body, on the basis of the Geneva Communique, will have the full executive power, and we are convinced that it would be the best ideal way to settle the Syrian crisis. That's what I wanted to announce to you. I give the floor to John.
We believe that the Geneva Communique is the important track to end the bloodshed in Syria. And it should not be a piece of paper. It should not be a forgotten communique of diplomacy. It should be the roadmap, the implemented manner by which the people of Syria can find their way to the new Syria, and by which the bloodshed, the killing, the massacres can end. Foreign Minister Lavrov and I have agreed that as soon as is practical, possibly and hopefully by the end of this month, we will seek to convene an international conference as a follow-on to last summer's Geneva conference. We believe that full implementation of the Geneva Communique calls for a transition governing body as specifically set forth in the language of the communique, which is formed by mutual consent with the support of the international community and enjoying full executive authority. That it means the full authority to run and manage the government, including the military and security services, and that doing so, as soon as we can possibly implement it, is the best way to resolve the crisis in Syria.
The first question will be from Arshad Mohammed from Reuters.
Foreign Minister Lavrov, what makes you think that President Assad would be willing to take part in a negotiated political solution if, as the United States has repeatedly said, he must leave power? And Secretary Kerry, why should ordinary Syrians who have seen tens of thousands of their countrymen die since last June's communique believe that a meeting held in a month or more might actually yield an end to this conflict? Why is that any more likely now than it was 10 months ago?
Я начну. То почему?
I would like to start. As for the prospects and the chances for the ongoing conflict to go into the political stage and for the parties to agree to work on the basis of the Geneva Communique, we base our position on the following facts. At this stage, we have a task to convince the authorities and all groups of opposition, as we emphasized with John, to sit down at the negotiations table. After Geneva Communique was adopted last June, the authority expressed its willingness to work following this plan. Afterwards, the government established a committee which is responsible for the dialogue with all Syrians, and yesterday, Foreign Minister of Syria reaffirmed that they are committed to the dialogue on the basis of the Geneva Communique, and that such committee will be mandated to carry out such negotiations. But these are just words. At this stage, I can tell you that I am convinced by the words which need to be transferred into action. But in order for the words to become action, we need to hear from the opposition as well. Opposition hasn't said a single word yet, which would confirm its commitment to the Geneva Communique. The opposition hasn't yet provided the negotiators. It is not by chance that we in today's statement speak on the need to make all opposition groups and authorities sit down at the negotiation table, all groups, because there are a number of them, and the coalition is not the representative of all groups in total. Such groups exist inside and beyond Syria. The task is to unite them on the platform of the willingness for negotiations. And when we hear the right words from the opposition, given the fact that the regime has already voiced the right words, then we will try to transfer such words into action. That's why we agreed to use opportunities existing in the US and in Russia to cooperate with all stakeholders, with Syrians themselves and outside players, in order to hold the international conference, which will be dedicated to the practical solution implementation of the provisions set in the Geneva Communique adopted last June. That said, I would like to emphasize that we are not interested in the fate of certain persons. We are interested in the fate of the total Syrian people, and it is up to the Syrians themselves to determine the fate of such persons and the people itself. That's what was agreed in Geneva last year, and today John and I expressed our common intention to create conditions for an inclusive Syrian dialogue to implement provisions set in Geneva Communique.
Just clarify for me the last part of your question. What will make the Syrian people
have any more? Why should the Syrian people have any more confidence today that what you have announced, hopes for a conference by the end of the month perhaps, and a joint effort to try to encourage both sides to come to the table, is any more likely to stop the violence, given how many deaths have occurred, and given particularly that your view is that Assad must go, and why should the Assad government go to a negotiation that entails its own demise?
Well, let me begin with the alternative. The alternative is that there's even more violence. The alternative is that Syria heads closer to an abyss, if not over the abyss, and into chaos. The alternative is that the humanitarian crisis will grow, and the alternative is that there may be even a breakup of Syria, or ethnic attacks and ethnic cleansing and other assaults which threaten the stability of the region and challenge the conscience of good people everywhere in the world. That's the alternative. Now, up until now, I think there has been a perception that Russia and the United States haven't been particularly on the same page or cooperating in this effort. So what I think is significant is that we are here to say that we are going to cooperate in trying to implement the Geneva Communique, and I think our understanding of that communique is very similar. There's actually more agreement, even though our position has been that it's impossible for me as an individual to understand how Syria could possibly be governed in the future by the man who has committed the things that we know have taken place, but I'm not going to decide that tonight, and I'm not going to decide that in the end. Because the Geneva Communique says that the transitional government has to be chosen by mutual consent by the parties. Who are the parties? The parties are the current regime and the opposition. So what we're going to undertake to do is to try to get them in a position where they, representing the people they represent, Syria and the interests they represent, put people into a transitional government by mutual consent. Now, I believe another thing is happening. I think a lot of people in the region and in the world are seeing this violence and frankly are really deeply concerned for the people of Syria and for the possibilities of peace, and that there will be a growing crescendo of nations who will want to push for a peaceful resolution, rather than the chaos that comes with the breakup of the country and the continued battle which can and will take place. Now, it's obviously up to the regime to undertake a set of behavior, to undertake steps here to guarantee that they're not using chemical weapons, they're not inviting greater reactions than exist today. And we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think that Sergey and I are both convinced that since Geneva is there and agreed on, the opposition went to Istanbul a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and in Istanbul they issued a set of declarations in which they signed on to, number one, support for the Geneva Communique, support for a transitional government. They signed on to a set of standards which would prohibit any use of chemical weapons. They agreed to be inclusive and democratic and protect all minorities inside Syria. And so I think there's the basis here for the people of Syria to have confidence that if we can achieve a transitional government and ultimately end the violence, the people of Syria will decide the future of Syria. And I think that's what Sergey wants, that's what I want, that's what President Putin and President Obama want, and that's what we're trying to implement.
Я хотел бы с разрешения Джона добавить два слова.
I would like to add a couple of words. You started your question with a phrase, why the Syrian people have to be more positive about what we are talking about and why our proposals can be a success. First, I would like to assure you that the Syrian people is not some abstract notion. The Syrian people is not only about regime. It is not only about their position, which has always been inside Syria and is now inside Syria. It is not only about their position, which for many years lived abroad and is now grouped in various formats. It's about all Syrians to whom the fate of their country is important, and by various estimates provided by different states and various services which deal with such issues, a significant part of the population is afraid that the regime will be overthrown. It is not because they like this regime. It is not because they like the ongoing horrific events in Syria, which is the reason of suffering among civilians in the first place, but because they are afraid that if those who fight the regime win, then Syria, from a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state where in peace and security for many years many religious confessions and religious groups have been living, it will turn into a country where extremists rule the day. And it is not spoken out publicly today. No, it has been, this opinion is shared by all my interlocutors. This is why, on the basis of not a simplistic approach, but on the basis of a realistic understanding of what Syrian people is, we, with John, put forward an initiative to unite all groups represented both by the regime and by the opposition. I hope that this chance,
особенно учитывая
especially given the willingness of the US and Russia to use all the opportunities, this chance will be used.